Hello, we the people. That's the opening words of the preamble of the Constitution of the United States of America. Hello, I'm Dr. Gloria Frederick, your host, and I'm so pleased that you're joining us today because our podcast is all about creating well-being in our community and supporting it. You know, a few months ago, I was watching C-SPAN, as I am wont to do quite often, and who should I see but Dr. Browne-Marshall talking about her book, A Protest History of the United States. I was so intrigued about what she had to say and do and what she did with that book. For example, the book spans a 400-year period. Can you believe it? More time than our country has been around. Also, she talked about the many forms that protests take and that people have different ways of responding to the issues that confront them, and that we in Eastern North Carolina needed to be aware of what she was talking about in her book, because we are now challenged to go to the polls in November, but to create a voting community now. And I think her book helps us to move forward. So I am so honored today that she is our guest. She is a professor of constitutional law at John Jay College at CUNY, an award-winning author and playwright, and a legal commentator. She has litigated cases for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the Southern Poverty Law Center, and Community Legal Services. And she is founder, director of the Law and Policy Group, Incorporated, a 501c3 organization and think tank that publishes the report on the status of Black women and girls. Welcome and thank you so much. Did I get it right? Is there something else you would like to add?
That's a wonderful introduction. Thank you.
Okay, let's get started then. You know, when I was reading your book, it was obvious to me that you're seeing so many patterns evolving over the years, many years. And what struck me was how the indigenous folks, that is the Native Americans, whose hospitality was taken advantage of, how they fought back. And so I was wondering if we could start with that story, because I think it's fascinating.
Thank you. Well, for one, I call the indigenous people the original protesters. They've been protesting for a very long time now. And what I find that is remarkable is that so many ways in which they protested back then, we're still using today. So when we think about the beginning of our country, too many of us believe the myth that the country began with the Pilgrims. It did not. The country did not begin with the Pilgrims. The country began in 1607 with the arrival of English people on ships that landed in what is now Virginia. And so when those ships landed, that was the intent of King James, the same King James of the Bible, King James, that
Yeah.
King James, yes, who decided to give a charter to businessmen to allow a colony to be formed in the name of England and the king. And so the other monarchs had colonies. France had colony, Spain, the Dutch had a colony, which is what New York was actually, when you think about it, was actually used to be called New Amsterdam because it was a Dutch colony. And so that came a little later, but these other monarchs had colonies, and so England wanted one. And so these businessmen asked the king for a charter to gain access to a colony that they would go to the New World, which is what North America was called, to start a business enterprise. And that business enterprise would then produce money that would make the king wealthy. Okay. And so,
yeah, got that.
Okay. So to do that, they land in what is now Virginia, in the land of the Powhatan Native Americans. And
Yeah.
so the protests begin with the arrival of these people who then are welcomed initially because they think, well, they just need provisions and they're going to leave. They landed in the Powhatan hunting ground area. So anybody who's gone to Jamestown, Virginia, and visited the Jamestown settlement know what I'm talking
That's
about. It's a
right.
swampy area. Nothing really grows there but grass and mosquitoes. And so the Powhatans thought they would come and leave. So they allowed them to, hunt for a while, but then they started overhunting the grounds. They started disrespecting the Native Americans, and the Native Americans said, okay, you can leave now. We're not going to do business with you anymore. So when you think about economic boycotts, the economic boycott, you can think, began with them because they said, we're not going to trade with you anymore. We're not going to teach you anything else. We're not going to allow you to use our hunting ground, our resources anymore. We want you to leave. The other thing that happened was that they had negotiations. Negotiations broke down, and they said, well, we're going to actually disrupt your ability to expand here. So we don't want you building anything else. And then a big drought came, and this is all in 1607. The drought comes in 1608. So it was so horrible. The drought was so horrible, and the Powhatans would not let them leave the fort they built because they said, we don't want you anywhere near us. Every time people would leave, they would then, try to kill them when they left the fort. And so,
that's kind of attention getting.
Yes, believe it or not, cannibalism became part of what happened in that fort with the people who were trapped there. They ate the horses, they ate the dogs, they ate the rats, they ate anything. They started eating each other. And this is documented in 1608 into 1609. And it was, and so what we need to understand is by 1619, the Africans arrived. Now, there have been Africans already in other parts of North America, but since our country begins with the history in 1607 with the English, so 1619, the Africans arrived. 1620, the Pilgrims arrived in Massachusetts. So Africans were there before the Mayflower landed. Africans were in North America before the Mayflower. And we need to understand that to understand the diversity this country has had from the very beginning. The other thing that the Native Americans did was to say, well, you're going to negotiate with us or else, we're not going to, because we know our land. And the product they ended up creating there, the crop was tobacco, which was very labor intensive. And so that tobacco crop becomes the money maker for the colony, and basically becomes a trigger for the need for more labor that they can't get as indentured servants or so-called white slaves. And so those people who were coming over from England were people seeking freedom and liberty. The people who were the leaders, the elite, were seeking money. So that, and I always like to say in the book, that's the conflict the country has had. One part of the country is about liberty and freedom, and the other part is about money, and they're at loggerheads all the time. So what the Native Americans have been fighting for their culture, for their land, for the land over which they're caretakers, for their resources, for their languages. So all of these things began early when Pocahontas, and there was a real Pocahontas, because Powhatan, the chief Powhatan, was Pocahontas's father. So he was the one who was negotiating on behalf of their government, and they had a government. The Native Americans had a structured government. That's why when people say, oh, the Europeans brought culture and civilization, they didn't. People already had a culture, they already had a religion, they already had art, they already had a government. So they didn't need the Europeans to bring them that. And they've said that even women were high level people within the Powhatan structure of government that was made up of lots of people, and the tribal leaders would come to Chief Powhatan to have their disputes recognized, and he would be that leader. And so he was the one who had on his shoulders, what do you do with these people? What do you do with these incursions of Europeans? More ships are coming, more people. Now the Africans are there, and the Native Americans are trying to figure out from and negotiating position, how do you deal with outsiders? How do you deal with trying to get them to see your point of view? So they tried, once again, another protest, learn your enemy's behavior and then try to interact with them knowing their behavior. So they tried a lot of different tactics at the time in order to get the Europeans to leave. And if they weren't leaving, to at least respect their ways.
Did that work? I mean, eventually, did that work?
Well, we see what history shows us that the Europeans had, see the difference, and this is something to learn about today. Are we studying our opponent? Do we actually
That's
know
why
what
I
our
asked the
opponent wants?
question.
Yes.
Yeah,
Because if
yeah.
we're not brutally honest with ourselves to understand what our opponent wants, then we will be caught in a vulnerable position. Because the Powhatans thought, one, that the opponent, the Europeans, wanted provisions and then they would leave. Second, and they were wrong, they were there to be there permanently. Second, the Europeans had no intention of sharing resources. They felt that they were superior and they should take over the land. And so the Powhatans and others were like, oh, we can share. Maybe we can share these resources, because the Powhatans didn't look at it as in a way in which they owned it.
Yeah,
They're like,
yeah.
this was given to us, so we can share it, but we have to share it in a way that's fair and respectful. And then to find out that the Europeans had no intention of being fair, no intention of being respectful. And so in underestimating the goals of the opponent, we find that even today, when we're dealing with issues in which we are protesting, do you understand the goals of your opponent? Do you understand what they really want? And so therefore your strategies have to meet what it is they really want, or else the chances are you're not going to be as successful as you could be.
To me, that's quite fascinating because it has so many lessons for today. And we'll get back to that because we need to talk about it. But let's move on just a little bit because I'm being respectful of time. A pattern that runs throughout your book and through American history, U.S. history, is that protest rarely takes a single form. It's like a mosaic. The sit-ins, the marches, the boycotts, the legal battles, the music, and everyday acts of resistance. Each each form emerged from specific historical moments, but together they create change. So most people in North Carolina, for example, are familiar with sit-ins because of Greensboro and what happened there. But can you talk about some of the patterns that you see um, with the women's movement, with the Pullman Porters movement, um, the voting rights movement? Can you talk about movements that have happened and which of those movements might resonate personally with you?
Well, you think about the voting rights movement, it did have many different aspects of protest. Even going into the registrar's office to register to vote, and not and then of course you had the poll tax, and you had the literacy tests, but refusing to take the literacy tests. or people
Yeah.
taking a literacy test. As you know, in North Carolina, you had two very famous women who took the literacy test and decided that when they said they failed it, that they would appeal that up to the U.S. Supreme Court. So litigation was part of protest as well. So you had cases that were brought. You had people that not only had the sit-ins, but you had people who were protesting in the streets. You had people who decided that they would be a part of teach-ins. And the teach-ins were very important because you had to learn what the issues are. Your show is a teach-in so that people have an idea of what is going on in their community. And so
Yes.
you had, the high school and college students who were a part of protests, and they wanted to have the high school and college students be a part of it, because if the parents were actually arrested, that would mean that the money from the whole household would be taken away. So that's why young people got involved with the protests. And you had meetings about nonviolence. And nonviolence was one mechanism of protest, of people who decided that they're not going to come to the protests with violence in mind, and they're not going to respond to violence with protests. And that's the difference between what people think of as nonviolent protests today, is the fact today they think if you go to the protest as nonviolent, but somebody hits you, you're supposed to respond with violence. And that's
Yeah.
why when they say, well, is that a nonviolent protest? That's not the nonviolent philosophy. So learning about Mahatma Gandhi and Barry Rustin, who learned as a Quaker about nonviolence, he actually was very instructive with Martin Luther King about nonviolence. And so there were all in the Black Panthers were another form of protest, because it was a Black Panthers for self-defense. So their thing was, we're not going to the protest with any act of violence, but if violence happens to us while we're there, we're going to defend ourselves. So you have a lot of different aspects of it. You had the women's movement, as you said, was taking place, and the women's movement would do things, and you have to be creative. And so the creativity was burning the bra. So people don't
Yeah.
remember
Yeah.
that. Remember back in the day when they would burn the bra?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes, so you've had different types of protests, but I would say that the civil rights protests actually had the most profound effect. And then after that, it would be the labor protests. Because the labor protests in creating a union was an actual protest against the working conditions, the working hours. We take for granted our 8-hour workday. But that 8-hour workday came through protest, even though it was a law that gave the 8-hour workday, but the employers didn't respect it until people protested to make it a reality, which took, decades for that to become a
Yeah.
reality. But the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Voting Rights Act, the 1968 Fair Housing Act, when you start thinking about the protests that led to that, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, few people who are immigrants realize that they're covered by the 1964 Civil Rights Act.
That's right.
Few women, especially white women and girls. When you see girls' sports, you're looking at the Civil Rights Act in reality. But many people don't realize, who are not African American, that a lot of the civil rights protections and laws affect and have granted them protections and laws as well, because the Civil Rights Act also covered religion when it came to work. So people aren't thinking of, whether they're Muslim or Jewish or whatever they may be, or from India, that, they've been protected by what Black people protested, fought, and died for, that they're actually being protected by it as well. So I would say the Civil Rights Act first, the civil rights movement, and then the labor movement would be the top two movements. That the anti-war movement did give us a lot of practical ways to protest, but
Mm-hmm.
as far as what affected the country most, and what stays front in my mind, would be those two movements.
The other thing that I wanted to talk about is you mentioned the labor movement, and we don't always think about um, the labor movement in conjunction with farming and the farmers. The Chavez, that was an amazing and sustained protest that was not really in the beginning recognized for what it was. Because, I mean, the immigrant labor, nobody was paying attention to it. Nobody cared that much about it, except the people who were involved in it directly. And they were not being educated. They were spending hours and hours and hours in the fields. So could you talk about that particular movement in conjunction with the overall labor movement?
The labor movement as well as the civil rights movement, because Cesar Chavez and Martin Luther King worked together. And so people forget, and that's what happens with protests. All that work goes into it and sacrifice, and then people forget once they get the benefit of the protest that it took protests to make it happen.
Mm-hmm.
And so you, as you pointed out, you had children who were child laborers in the field. You had pesticides that these people were breathing. You had no toilets out there, no schools. All of this was being done to people who were the farm laborers.
Yeah.
And this was at a time when they would intentionally allow farm laborers to come across the border, or they would go from crop to crop within the United States, undocumented or documented, and they would work for the farms. And so one of the protests that took place was around grapes. They said, oh, if you think about how much you have to do, how much bending of the back to pick these grapes, and then to put them in, and you have these giant bags, and people may remember the giant bags used to trail the people that were the cotton sacks, that people had to
Mm-hmm.
fill up those cotton sacks. Well, if you think about, they did the same thing with the fruit and the vegetables. And so, Cesar Chavez was like, we need a working wage. We need a place where we can live. They lived in almost like shacks where there was not running water. It was horrible, the conditions. And so he brought the condition to the rest of the country. The labor movement at first did not pay attention, because even when Martin Luther King, when he lost his life in Memphis, was there for the sanitation workers, that labor movement initially didn't recognize the union that the sanitation workers wanted to create.
That's right.
The same thing
Yeah.
took place with Cesar Chavez, that the labor unions were slow to the table. They had to be forced to recognize it. A. Philip Randolph, same thing. When he was creating the Pullman Porters Union, that's because the other unions would not recognize the ability of Black men to be part of their unions. So he had to start his own union and then get that union recognized by these other major unions. So you're fighting battles within your group, you're fighting battles outside of your group, and you're protesting all of these different levels all the time. And that's why strategy is so important. And Martin Luther King, Cesar Chavez, when you start looking at, Chief Powhatan, these are strategists. So it's not
Yeah.
enough to stand and shout with a sign. That's great. And I give all props to those people, because protest of any form is risky, especially putting yourself out in the street. But doing so with a strategy, with a goal in mind, is essential to moving things in the direction you want to go and having a goal. And so here's one quick example. Cesar Chavez got people to say, if you eat grapes, then you are helping the corporations that are doing this to children out in the field. So they had a
Yeah.
campaign. Messaging is important for protests. People
Yeah.
have to see it, they have to know it, they have to be moved by it. So when you have a sign, it's not enough for you to have a sign for the other protester. That sign should be something that moves the bystander to become a part of your protester in their own way, be a part of your protest, I should say, or become a protester in their own way. And so Cesar Chavez got the people to move. They got the children's faces to show what they were going through. People stopped eating grapes. They stopped buying grapes. And so they became, in their own homes, a protester. And I think that's what's essential. The strategy, how do you get people who are not in your affected groups to care about your issue and also to lend their voice or in some way become a part of your protest? And so he was able to do that. He had to then get the labor movement itself and the labor unions to see the importance of the farm workers. All of these things brought strategy, and that's what great leadership is, the ability to negotiate on all these different levels and to have far-reaching strategy and a council of people to advise them. And so I think that the labor movement sometimes is slow because it has its own prejudices too. And sometimes
Yeah.
it's slow to the table when it comes to people of color. But it's a powerful platform and foundation that many people in the civil rights movement went through the labor movement and learned from it in order to build the civil rights movement.
There are two things that I'm intrigued about. One is the individuals who who had the spark that says something's not right, and I need to do something about the something that's not right, even if it puts me in peril. I need to say this is not right, and this is what I'm going to do about it. So that's a fascinating thing to me because it requires so much of yourself to be involved in this. So could you talk about some of the issues around individuals making that decision to um, to lead in another direction?
Well, when I wrote my book, A Protest History of the United States, I'm thinking about the United States. I'm thinking about the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the Native Americans, the labor movement, the climate change movement. There are so many different movements. And I thought, do I want to write a book about just the movements alone? But to me, the people also make up the story. And
Yeah.
so I wanted to include people as well. So I actually interviewed different activists to get their mindset. Why did you decide to participate? Frank Smith was from Mississippi. He said the first time he slept in a bed by himself was when he went to Morehouse. And
Yeah.
that was the first time he slept alone in a bed because he was asleep with at least one or two
Of
siblings,
his
you know,
siblings.
when he,
Yeah.
yes, and so here he is seeing the segregation in Atlanta and deciding, even though his parents were barely scraping it together for him to go to Morehouse, that he would be involved in SNCC. And so here he is as a student protesting the segregated richest department store that was in downtown Atlanta.
Hmm.
I also interviewed Howard Moreland, who was an anti-war protester, and Frank Smith is Black. Howard Moreland is white. Howard Moreland was at Emory at the same time, at the exact same time. And he also sees the segregated riches department store, and he decides that he and his friends are going to protest. Now, they said that same thing you said, this just isn't right. This just isn't fair. And everyone could be walking by and going along with the program. These segregated stores would allow Black customers to come in, but they couldn't try on any clothes.
Yeah.
They couldn't work there. They just had to buy something. If it didn't fit, it was just too
And
bad.
they
You had to
couldn't
wear
eat
it
in the
anyway.
restaurants of those stores.
Yeah, they couldn't eat at the restaurant of those stores. And sometimes, and you couldn't go to the bathroom in those stores.
Exactly.
And
And you
so,
couldn't drink from the water fountains except the
yes,
segregated ones.
yes. And so, for both of those now grown men, when they were college students, to decide to take a stand. And so Frank Smith and his fellow students would march in front of Rich's department store carrying a sign, and Howard Moreland and his friends from Emory went into the store, sat down and negotiated. And it's like, okay, are you gonna? And they had not talked. They never met, and here they
Really?
are, both at the same place in history, deciding they're going to take a stand. So sometimes it's a personal part of a person. And I'll give this one last example. And this is not in my book, A Protest History of the United States. But I remember being on a panel with a white woman, and she said, I didn't want to be an activist. And she was a mother. She said, but I had a child born with severe disabilities. And that made me an activist because I had to be a voice for him. So there are
Hmm.
many ways that people come to their activism. Sometimes they watch, like with George Floyd being murdered and before our eyes, and people are like, no, that crosses the line. I cannot sit back idly because that could be my son, that could be my uncle, that could be my father. So if they see themselves in that other person, they see themselves in that situation, or if it goes against their values. And that's why people need to know what their values are, because you don't
That's
know if
right.
your values have been crossed if you don't know what your values are. And some people are in church, and they're in church, but are you actually going based on living your life based on Christian values? And if so, what are your Christian values telling you about particular situations? And so, or whether or not they're Jewish, whether or not they're Muslim, what are your religious values telling you? If you're not a religious person, then you do live values day to day. What are those values? And so you have many people based on those values, based on seeing the situation and seeing themselves in that situation. That could be me, that could be somebody I can relate to. Those people then become part of a protest, and protest in their own way. Some people are not into going out in the streets. Well, then
Yes.
economic boycott. then don't buy from companies that don't respect you, or don't
That's right.
respect your values. Once again, you
Hmm.
have to know what your values are to know if they're being disrespected.
One of the things that I think about is what's going on in Minneapolis, in Minnesota, with the protest, and they interviewed people who had never been involved in protest at all. But what was happening in Minneapolis was so egregious that they felt that they had to go out and be there and bring their signs and talk to their neighbors. So that's one form of the protest in Minneapolis. But the other one is to take food to families that feel intimidated about leaving, to have churches that are involved in protecting uh, the folks, the citizens of Minneapolis. As you just said, the protest takes many forms, but we need all of those because we're not, as individuals even, we're different. And so we need a comfort level, which is what you were talking about, in how you protest. And ICE has just kind of made a lot of us who were just kind of looking at life go out and say, this isn't right. This is not how we're supposed to live our lives.
But there are
And
also people, there's always going to be people who look at it and do nothing. And
yes,
that's what we need to understand. If we get so frustrated with the people who do nothing, because as Martin Luther King said, it was a silence of the good people. Good people who sat back see the same thing you're seeing. And that's why it's just something inside different people to say, I've got to act where their neighbor is seeing the same exact thing and they do nothing. But we can't allow the inaction of others to keep us from acting.
that's exactly right. And in your book, you talk about um, individuals who kind of said, I need to, I'm not going to do anything. I'm just going to sit here. Rosa Parks is kind of an example of that. She just sat there and said no. And some of our protests might just be saying no, as opposed to getting out and saying, I got to do. So, are there examples of like that in your book as well?
Yes. And in particular, if you think about the people who finance protests, who are behind the scenes, you may
It's a
never
good
know.
one.
Aretha Franklin was one of them. Aretha Franklin would give money to Martin Luther King, and Aretha Franklin would give money to others in other protests. That money is needed to pay for the buses, to rent the buses, to give food, to paint the signs, to hire organizers. So people may not want to go out into the protest streets, but they can be a part of the protest by giving money. What about the bond fund? There are people who need bail money. And so there are
Yes,
funds that were put together for bail money for those people who have been arrested. Lawyers need it. As I said before, those cases that are being brought are cases that are protest cases. They're there to support the social justice cause. And so the lawyers are needed. Lawyers are needed to actually bail people out sometimes. You may not be a protest lawyer if there's such a thing, but the
that's right.
ACLU, for example, the website has a lot of information for protesters to look at. So there are people who may want to drive the cars. You think about the Montgomery bus boycott. You had people driving people to work, and that way they were part of the protest, even though they might not have been out on the street. So there are many ways in which people can protest. And I'm glad you mentioned Rosa Parks, because when I was thinking about my book titled A Protest History of the United States, I was thinking about Rosa Parks because initially my book was going to be a legal argument on behalf of protests and deal with the protest cases. But then I realized that not all protests result in legal cases. And
Right.
so, and especially if you have a protest like Rosa Parks protest, you don't imagine Rosa Parks. I'm sure she's done it, but you don't imagine her with a sign in the street. You see her in a quiet way doing her part of the protest. But Rosa Parks was also a Garveyite. So we need to
Yeah.
understand that she was, yes, she used to investigate the rapes of Black women by white men. before she was secretary of the NAACP. So she like Malcolm X. Think about who would have put Malcolm X and Rosa Parks in the same sentence, but they were both Garveyites. And so the followers of Marcus Garvey. So there are ways in which people could have a very strong sense of justice, but they might not show it displayed in the same way. And so we have to have all different ways in which people can participate in social justice.
You know, the other name that surfaces for me is Ida B. Wells. She was keeping track of all of the hangings and lynchings. She wrote about it, but and she was a member of the NAACP, but she, as far as I know, she didn't go out and say, we got to stop this in the
Well,
way that,
she marched early on for women's rights in the suffragist movement.
yes,
So she
yes,
was one of the marchers, and she actually integrated the white women's suffragist movement because they wanted to segregate by race. Now here they are asking, demanding equal rights from men, but then segregating themselves from Black women. But Ida B. Wells Barnett was one of the marchers around the White House during the Woodrow Wilson era. But I would say another person is Daisy Bates. And Daisy Bates was
yes,
someone you're not thinking of with a sign in her hand protesting. I'm sure she did in certain ways, but she was the one who helped the high school students integrate Central High School. She was the
mhm,
one who refused to give away the membership lists of the Little Rock NAACP when it was demanded by the Secretary of State. She went to jail for that. She was part of the litigation that went up to the U.S. Supreme Court. So she was part of protests in many other ways, but we don't see her as somebody with a sign in her hand. So it depends on one's personality, what they have to offer, what their resources are, their level of creativity. You have
yes,
people who are involved in messaging. And that's very important to come up with the messages that you can put on the sign that can, as I said, you have to get the attention of people who are not in the protest, the people who are the bystanders, and get them involved in your protest. And that's why, for me, A Protest History of the United States is a book written to empower people who are on the sidelines, who are trying to figure out
yes,
where they
yes,
fit in, but it's also to keep the inspirational fires going for those people who are protesters, who want to know what other people have done in history so that they too can feel the fire and be a part of a stream that is flowing through, and they can, everybody just is a part of the stream. It continues to flow, whether or not you're there for a moment or you're there for a lifetime. You know,
exactly.
every contribution is helpful.
And that's what I think is so beautiful about your book. It's that it covers so much ground, but it also gives the individuals a place to start if they want to protest. Um, when we come back, we're going to take a brief break. I'd like for you to talk about activism as a heartbeat. I'm looking at your book here as a heartbeat. That was really an intriguing idea and concept. So that's something that needs exploration. So we'll be back in a couple of minutes, and we'll resume our conversation with Dr. Gloria, another Gloria, uh, Browne-Marshall. Hang on. You're listening to Voices of We the People, and our guest, as I just mentioned, is Dr. Marshall, Browne-Marshall. What you might ask is next for our podcast. Our next guest is Dr. Hassan Crockett, Dean of the Liberal Arts and Humanities, and he's professor at Livingstone College. He's going to be talking about something that's really interesting, and it's another way to empower people, but a different way. One of the things he's been doing research on is boards and commissions. He says that there are about 80,000 boards and commissions in North Carolina, many of which are vacant. And as individuals, we can serve on some of those boards and commissions. We just need to know how to get there, what they do, and what our role might be. So he's going to be talking about that. Um, he also has come up with a little scorecard so that if you are interested in seeing how the person or people that you voted for are performing, and doing what you thought they would do when you cast your ballot, he has a scorecard. So he's going to be talking about that. Beginning March 24th, Voices of We the People will take a break. We're going to be exploring other countries and then we'll report back. Upon our return, we'll focus on affordability, what we mean and who is included. And we're going to start with Gen Xers, Gen Zs, what they think about affordability, what that means to this age group, which is 14 to 29. That group has a different perspective because, first of all, this is the group that sleeps and eats technology. This is the group that this is where they started. Those of us who are boomers, if we are into technology, this is how we kind of backdoor it in. But this is how they start. So tune in April 14th. That's our next episode when we return. And if you want to participate, go to our website and just drop us an email and let us know if you are a Gen Xer, a Gen Zer. I get them mixed up. A Gen Zer. I think that we are having a great discussion, I believe so, with Dr. Browne-Marshall. We're going to go back to our discussion, and she's going to talk about, as I mentioned, this is her book. Oh, cool. And in this book, she talks about activism has a heartbeat. And when I saw this, I'm thinking, what in the world does that mean? And it's that there's a spirit, there's a rhythm to how first of all, how we see the problem or the issue, and then how we go about trying to do something about it. I didn't write the book. I just read that little bit that said, this is great. So we'll get back to our guest who has given us so much great information. And I'm so pleased that she's with us today. So let's start with that, Dr. Browne-Marshall, that idea of activism. It's a heartbeat.
Yeah, because it becomes an organism. That's why movement is an active word when you think about it. It may sound like it's a noun, but it's actually an active word. Movement, meaning that things are moving. Activism is an active word because things are happening, they're coming together. And especially when one is with others and they're standing together and they're shouting and they're petitioning the government for a redress of grievances, which is the last
Yeah.
line of the First Amendment. And
Yes.
youth exercising their freedom of speech, exercising their freedom of assembly, and they're coming together using their bodies to show the government or a corporation or whatever it may be that there is something wrong here that needs to be fixed. There's a sense of a heartbeat as people are coming together with that spirit and the sense that they are a part of something greater than themselves. And they have created a second entity. The individuals have now created an entity that has its own heartbeat, and the continuation of that vibration and that vibrancy is part of activism. And so that's why the rallies, and there's a difference between a rally to me and a protest. The rally is what we saw initially in 2025 with people coming together and cheering in the streets. They're trying to gain community, they're trying to encapsulate the spirit and share the grievances. What are we complaining about? Let's come together in that. So you saw that in parks and on street corners. And then after a while, it moves to protest. Protest to me has a level of disruption. Now, whether or not it's just a lot of people stopping traffic, stopping that traffic is a disruption. So people sometimes think that disruption is the same as violence. And that's not what I'm saying. Disruption is when you stop the status quo from saying because if you don't stop the status quo from acting in unjust ways, then you haven't really done anything. The point is not
Yeah.
to have a rally as the status quo continues to act in just ways and feeling no discomfort with it. You have to make the status quo uncomfortable with this injustice. And so that's why that heartbeat, the continuation, the crowd, the sense that you're doing something that's, even if I'll give this one last example of the protests against Target stores and Amazon. You know, people may be in all their different living rooms around the country, but they're part of something bigger than themselves, because the
Yeah.
effect is that the CEO of Target ended up having to step down, you know, from, because the sales had stopped. So even though we were different places, we were all part of the heartbeat of that economic boycott.
And we don't always appreciate the impact of our little bitty protest of not going to Target, but a whole lot of people say we're not going to Target. And that's when that culmination happens. That's when that beat starts to get together and the
Yes.
CEO resigns. You know, the other thing I wish that you would talk about, first of all, I'm sorry we don't have a passage for you to read of your book. And if there's something that strikes you that you'd like to share, that's great. But you also talk about this, that silence will not protect you. What did you mean by that?
Well, Audre Lorde said your silence would not protect you, and I repeat it often, as well as power to the people, because as Martin Luther King said, that it was the silence of the good people that he felt was something that that always stayed with him. And the silence, people are standing on the sidelines, and this is something that's going on right now with Black women, because of what happened with Kamala, because of what happened with Latinos voting for Donald Trump in such numbers, that there are people who are saying, this is not our fight, we're going to sit this one out, as though we have that privilege. You know, this is not a country where a group can just sit something out, especially if that group is African American. I mean, we
That's
might
right.
have thought we got that far. I mean, that's really a mindset that we really think that if we don't say anything, nobody's going to come to us. When we're getting our history erased every day, we're having our books banned, we're having our jobs taken, and we really think if we just be quiet, that this cup will pass our lips. You know, it's like, no, we're going to be tasting the bitter wine too. And unfortunately, being silent has not protected Black people as much as we think it has. You know, we really do believe being amiable got us that job. No, being amiable didn't get you the job. People protesting a generation before opened the door that allowed them to look at your resume, that then you were equipped to do the job and got interviewed for the job. And there were enough lawsuits brought that they knew they better not be outright discriminatory and not giving you that job. Now, being amiable on the job may have made you some friends, but that didn't get you the job. And so many people right now don't have the feel of the fight. And that fight is a powerful
Yeah.
one. And so we just lost Jesse Jackson, as you know, as all North Carolina knows. Jesse Jackson had the feel of the fight. And if you don't have the feel of the fight, if you just want to be silent, then you need to move out of the way, because this
Yes.
is not a time for people who just want to sit and be quiet. That's not going to
It is
save
not.
you in the end. And it's not going to save the rest of us. And Black people cannot afford leadership that just wants to sit there and be quiet.
You know, one of the things that struck me about what Doge was doing, you know, in the early phases of it, um, and I'm one of the African Americans who got training and went and got education so that we could better ourselves and get better jobs. It didn't matter when this guy came along. It did not matter.
No.
And and so I keep thinking, how do we protect ourselves with whatever happened with Doge and our education? Because some of us were saying, I made it. You know, I have this degree and I have this high level job. It didn't matter.
As a matter of fact, that's the reason why they're coming for us. It was our progress that bothers them. So
Yes.
it's that degree. It's that high level job, it's that income, it's that house, it's that car, it's that lifestyle that bothered them in the first place. Because the sense was, how dare you have
Yes.
much or more than I do, than a white person, any white person does. And so I think it's important for us to realize why this is happening. And if we don't know why it's happening, then we could believe that that title is going to protect us when that title is the lightning rod that's saying, come for that person, which is horrific. Anybody else, you would want them to be well educated. But then on the other side, they'll say, oh, it's diversity, equity, inclusion that got you that job, even though they
Yes.
took away affirmative action and now they want to call it something else. So we need to understand no matter what we have, people will try to undermine it and make it appear as though we don't deserve it. So we have to have our mindset not based on just our alma mater. I'm a member of Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority, but not based on just being a member of the Divine Nine, not just based on your title. You've got to be a part of a community to know that you're part of something greater than yourselves, and you have to protect what's greater than yourselves and not just yourself. So that lift yourself up by your bootstraps might have helped other people in other cultures, but that's not our culture, and that's not how that person got that title in the first place.
Well, you know, one of the things that strikes me about what the Doge folks did is we we didn't have somebody to cover us, you know, to watch our back. And that too is a form of protest, to say we're a community and we're not we're not going for this, and this is how we're going to combat what's going on. I am so surprised that, I guess maybe not really surprised, but it's bothersome that we could be just dismissed so summarily, so
Well, that's,
quickly, and
but you know
so
what?
deeply.
But but here's the thing. This is what bothered me. We have all these black people in Congress and, fair-minded,
Yep.
social justice oriented white people.
Mhm.
No
Mhm.
one knew this was happening. No one had a clue that Project 2025 was coming. What kind of people do we have in Congress that no one is paying attention? Nobody is asking any questions. No one has infiltrated their side to know what they're doing.
Yes.
I'm just stunned by the naivete of people who actually believe we've come so far that we don't have to keep our eye on what's going on the other side of the fence. I
Thank
mean,
you.
but see, the thing is, when I say things like this, groups, and I'm not going to name any of them, are like, oh, we don't want to think that way. That is not how we've been able to survive. We
That's that
have to
silence
know.
thing.
Yes, we've got to know what these people are doing. That's
Yeah.
how we've survived. So if we're going to act as if we are just in places of such security that nothing can touch us because we have a title, well, the title is gone. Money is gone. We
Mhm.
spend so much time as Black people hurting each other, undermining each other, when we should be thinking about how we as a community can be protected and grow and educate our children to know that they need to be protected and to grow as well. So there's
Yes.
a lot of the basics that our ancestors gave us, and freedom freeloaders is a phrase that I use. And these freedom freeloaders are freeloading off what the ancestors did in order to have their individual successes without thinking about what needs to happen for the group as a whole. And now they're
And for
seeing.
what comes behind them.
Yes. And now they're seeing, for all that selfishness, you're lumped in the group anyway. You might have thought you were by yourself. You might have thought that you were just, had made it. They've tossed you in the group with the rest of us. So you were always in the group. You just had to be reminded you were in the group. And they did that. They held up a mirror and reminded you that you were in the group with the rest of us. And so use that intellect that they were paying you all that money to use for the corporation or for the nonprofit or for whatever. Use that in the strategies that we need today in order for us to be successful in this moment.
I have a couple of questions. We're going to have to wrap up in about 5 minutes or so. But I have and if we want to talk a little longer, we can. Um, is the idea of protesting And at the very beginning of your book, you say that music teacher said that protest is an investment. Talk about that. I mean, I don't
Mrs.
want you to put
Baskins.
words in your music teacher's mouth, but what does she mean by that?
Mrs. Baskins and I was back home in Kansas City, Missouri. I've been in New York now for like 30 years or more, but I was back home doing a book talk in Kansas City, Missouri, my hometown, and I had to give a shout out to Miss Baskins. Mrs. Baskins was so frustrated with our concert choir. We were horrible. We behaved terribly, and I was been bussed over to the white school. It was senior year. It was just it was just bad. And I want her to forgive me, please, because she was trying to instill in us when she had us sing Freedom Isn't Free. And that song resonates in my mind. And so as I go forward, I'm like, she was investing in us to help us to better understand that your freedom you have right now is not free. And as Coretta Scott King said, that each generation has to win it anew. And so the song is Freedom Isn't Free.
Yeah,
You've
yeah,
got to sacrifice. And so you got to pay the price for your liberty. And now that's a song I learned in my
yeah.
high school concert choir that Mrs. Baskins taught me. She was investing in me. And so, what I do on this podcast, for anybody who's listening, what I do in writing this book that took me 10 years to write, A Protest History of the United States, what I do is try to empower people. And as frustrating as it is, and I'm probably as frustrated as Mrs. Baskins is, because I would talk to people and some of them listen, some of them don't. And I just see her is like when I talk to my students, some of them listen, some of them don't. And I feel like I know now what she was feeling, but we have to invest anyway, especially in our young people. We have to invest from generation to generation to help them to understand that they're important, they are
Yes,
loved, and they are vessels for the future. And we need to let them know that. And we
yes.
need to say to them, as I say to people, I am a proud African American, because there's so much that tells us what's bad about our community. Do we ever talk about the pride we have in our community? Do we ever say it out loud to our young people? So it's not just negative stuff happening all the time. We know about the gang. We know about people getting shot. We know about I've had enough stuff happen in my own family. But we've got to also tell our young people, invest in them, because as I say, spirituality, faith is also protest. And investment in our future is
Yes,
protest
it
against
is.
people who would have us look as though we have no future. So for us to continue, just like the indigenous did, to continue to embrace their language, their culture, despite forced assimilation, we need to continue to embrace our culture and stand up for it and make sure that if they don't teach those books in the classroom, that we teach them in the living room. We don't have to just go through the schools
That's
if the
right.
school's not
That's
doing
right.
it. The churches are too empty during the week. We could be doing something in those churches during the week. That's what we did during the civil rights movement. The churches weren't empty. They were places for learning, for teachings, for investment in our young people.
You know, the church that I attended in New Jersey was probably called about 200 years old now. But right after the Civil War, this church wasn't as African American church. It was involved in all kinds of stuff, like helping the citizens in the town to get a trade, to get an education. They started a school. Those things aren't lost. We just don't do them anymore, and we have to. We have to bring back those kinds of issues and problem solving for ourselves and the children that you mentioned. We must.
What I see in New York City is that certain ethnic groups have taken different areas and they've
Yeah,
taken over those areas.
yeah,
And we need to have the Urban League used to have job training. Now it has a beautiful building here in New York City. I hope there's going to be job training in that building. I hope that we're going to teach those people who are formerly incarcerated a skill or get them into positions in which they can have their own money, their own jobs, their own apartments, their own futures. We've got to look at our own community and figure out what we need. And as a protest against those who would, and I believe is genocide, continue to
Yes,
annihilate us,
yes, yes.
undereducate us, undermedicate us, and keep us in a position of always wanting and needing more. We had risen to a certain level, as I
And
said, and
having
that's
people
what,
think that we can't do any better.
yes.
And having people think we can't do any better.
And we know we can, but we also
We
know
know
there's
we
so many
can.
forces outside of us that are undermining our progress. But we've been able to do so much with so little. But our ancestors
Okay.
had even less and did even more. So we need to. That's why I wanted in my book, A Protest History of the United States, I wanted to make sure that people understood that even if you don't have that much, there is something you can do. That everybody can do something.
Let me ask you this. I have two, I think, short questions. In
Mhm.
2026, with so much on the line with our elections and voting, if you were to give advice to somebody who's never been involved in protesting, what would you tell them in an elevator speech, so to
In
speak?
an elevator speech, I would tell them that the rights, 90% of the rights you wake up with every day came by way of protest. That we could have laws on the books, but the laws then became reality because of protest. And if you are immigrated into this society, it's because you found this country attractive. Protesters made it attractive for you. So I would say to those people who are second generation immigrants to this country, what are you doing to invest in the country that invested in you to lay the
Yes,
groundwork for
yes,
you to have the life you have here? And there are too many people who are immigrating from the Caribbean and from Africa who are sitting on the sidelines thinking that African Americans are supposed to do all the work. So
yes.
protest is what got you where you are today. And if you want to have your children have what you've had, then you need to start protesting as well.
Okay, one thing as we close, what gives you right now, what gives you the most concern as you go around with the book tours and talk about your book? And also, what gives you the most joy? What makes you smile?
What gives me the most concern is the silos. Divide and conquer is such an
Yeah.
effective weapon against protest. I'm seeing Black women over here. I'm seeing immigrant issues over there. I'm seeing anti DEI not getting any visibility the way it should. I see white protesters who are progressives, who are allies. I see men, these different silos. We've got to come together, especially because this administration is a regime that is intent on destroying our voting rights. And so we
Yes.
have to come together in order to be the strongest we can against this authoritarian regime that is led by Donald Trump. And once again, I like to say every day, I rebuke Donald Trump in the name of Jesus. Amen. Okay. The other,
Amen. Amen.
what makes me smile, I just talked yesterday or Saturday with the Jackie Robinson Foundation scholars. And these are young people who are smart, who are committed to their communities from all over the country. We need to listen to these young people because they have things to say. They
Yeah.
may not get it all right, but we didn't either. So, generationally, we need to work together. We need to figure out how to communicate with each other. And we need to, like the same with the tech, if you've got the tech, other people have the experience. Let's come together and make a movement. Power to the people.
Fantastic. Power to the people. This has been such an inspirational conversation for me. And I'm in awe of this book, but also of what you bring to the book, your personalities. We didn't get to talk about music and we didn't get to talk about some of the legal things. But we talked about those things that I think are important for this time, for this space. It's been such a joy to have you as our guest. And please, this is the book, A Protest History of the United States. Make sure I got it. And where can our listeners find this book and how can they support you?
They can find the book online at the usual places, but they can also find it at their bookstore. And they go to their bookstore, they ask for the book, and they want the book on the shelf. So they'll say, I'll order the book for you. So, like, no, I want this book on your shelf. So
Mm-hmm.
that's one way you can support me. The other way you can support me is that I am doing this 250th anniversary of our country. That's what this year is. So July 4th will be the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, and that's
Right.
our anniversary of this country. So I'm going around the country speaking in different places. So you can invite me to come and speak, and I'm looking forward to that. My website is Browne-Marshall23.com. That's Brown with an E hyphen Marshall, Marshall 23.com. And there you can, send me an email and tell me like where or what, and ask me questions about what I've talked about today. Or you can ask me
Yeah.
questions about, am I available to come and speak at your group? And I've been to libraries. That's been very exciting. And I've been to 25 states so far,
Oh, wow,
and
that's
so many.
exciting.
Yes, very exciting. So I'm looking forward to coming to North Carolina if I'm invited there. But yes, so I'm just I'm looking forward to people asking for the book, but putting it on the shelf at your bookstore, your local bookstore.
Fantastic. Again, it's been my pleasure, my joy, and I'm in awe. And I'm going to continue to tell people about this book. It's on my shelf, and I want it to be on others' shelf. It's inspirational. The history is something we have to make sure that we understand because that gives grounding for us. If we understand our history, we understand where we might take our lives and our communities. And that's so important for us. And to our audience, don't forget to go to our website, voicesofwethepeople.com, and give us feedback on today's program. You can also suggest future topics and guests. You can take take a look at the past podcasts. I remember talking to somebody recently who was saying, I saw your podcast. Oh, so good. And most of all, you can support our work with your donations and sponsorships. Let me share this quote from Rosa Parks, this is Women's History Month in March. And so she said, I had no idea that history was being made. I was just tired of giving up. None of us can give up. None of us can afford to give up. We, like Rosa Parks, have work to do. Our special thanks to Tamika Robinson of Blue Lady Radio. She's our podcast manager and director, and James Frederick, who does all things technical. And remember, Dr. King said, so long as I do not firmly and irrevocably possess the right to vote, I do not possess myself. I cannot make up my mind. It is made up for me. I cannot live as a democratic citizen, observing the laws I have helped to enact. I can only do that if I vote. So thank you all for listening. Again, thank our guest, Dr. Browne-Marshall, and we'll have some more information about how you can contact her on our website. Have a good evening.